Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next part of our Q&A session, ongoing Q&A session since the last iteration of the lecture. By now, the second iteration of the Dhamma lecture has started, and in case you want to participate by leaving your questions, then you can also do that in the comments below or reach out to us by any other means. And if the question has not been answered yet, which is quite important, then we will answer it in the future. Today we have the regular Q&A, as in we probably present you with 3 to 5 additional questions, we will see. And we start with a rather interesting one, and the person in question wants to know, my job requires 99 to 100% focus, and I feel like I stagnate at the time. What should I do to make my livelihood more skillful there? You want to start?
You want to start? I'm curious what you would say.
Sure. Um, yeah, I guess depending on the job, I'm a computer scientist, and sometimes I have to sit in front of my screen pretty much all day and code. And during the time of coding, it's actually quite difficult to practice a Dhamma, I would say. Giving a lecture or talking to other people, that's rather simple. You can do that pretty much on autopilot. But for some reason, coding or doing some complex or complicated activity that really requires focusing and attention makes it a bit more difficult. That said, if you have set up your intentions rightly before you started your pretty much work period, then I don't really see any problem as long as you do not drift off into some kind of unwholesome behavior. But if you are generally behaving wholesomely before and after and do not lapse in between, then that period of intense focused work is at best a period of stagnation where nothing too bad can happen. So you kind of require an intentional giving in to certain impulses to lose your wholesomeness, so to speak. It's an intentional activity, and that does not just get lost when you have to work in an absorbed style. So at best, it's a short break from more dedicated practice. You will not get the deepest kind of work done, but you can maintain the general levels that you have gotten accustomed to. But maybe you have a different take.
That's pretty much the same. I mean, it almost reminds me of like when it talks about when you go to sleep, like before you go to sleep, you set up the intention beforehand to like wake up at a certain time. Um, Obviously, like you're sleeping during that time, but because you set up the intention like in advance, um, that's how you sort of stay mindful even when you're sleeping, because it's all that sleep is being sort of contained um, within that container of mindfulness that's been set up in advance. So, like you say, if it's um, before you go into the heavy work, you set up your intention right to keep the mind pure, to not give in to sensuality and distraction and so on. Then, um, like like you probably won't be doing like super deep work, but at the very least, you won't like slip into like actual unwholesome behavior, like breaking the precepts or something like that. So I think yeah, just setting up that container beforehand can really be helpful. Um, I'll also make the sort of ob obligatory comment on like thinking about your work as well and livelihood. In terms of like, yeah, there are some jobs that are going to be more conducive to Dhamma practice than other ones. So if you've got one that requires like you to be like on call 24/7 and it's like really intense, emotionally heavy work and you're stressed all the time, then you know, um, that's it's gonna make it harder for Dhamma practice. That's just kind of how it is. Right? So
I
you can
mean,
also think about the work that you're doing. But obviously, that's a bit more of a broader thing.
well, but still a very good and fruitful comment, I think. The absorbed style of work is not necessarily the best style of work, I would say, when it comes to Dhamma practice. I guess, I mean, we already made videos about that in the past, but if you can choose a job where you can get prolonged periods of seclusion, and that does not require too much of your mental capacity at all times, where you can be very efficient so that you can generate free time, etc. So if you have a job that requires 99 to 100% of your focus at a time, but leaves you with much open-end practice time, that's still very good, I would say. At least if you don't have, I don't know, 12 hours of that you have to do. But I don't think any job would require that, or that you could do that for very long. Yeah. But overall, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to like setting up that context thing, I mean, you can to make it like as practical as possible. You can do that as well by like setting up a morning routine of, having like, even if it's at the beginning, like 2 or 3 minutes, but hopefully you'd have it longer than that. You can just have a certain period of time where you just focus on either just trying to dwell without hindrance for that time, just to calm the mind, set a little bit, or you can spend that time like doing something like the five contemplations, the daily contemplations the Buddha talked about in terms of like contemplating impermanence and all of those things. And as a result, if you stick to that every day, um, even if you get really absorbed into your work or whatever, that context is going to carry over. It's going to sort of seep into and saturate your experience such that, it doesn't matter how distracted you get, it won't be to the full extent where you'll ever really lose that fundamental perspective. So like very practically, you can have that as a setup compared to, I feel like it's quite common. Maybe like you wake up and you have this like mad rush of, drinking your coffee and washing your face and then getting in the car. But um, if you can have that like sort of slower pace, then you can set up that context for the day a bit easier. And the same for like before you go to sleep, like I mentioned before. Like if you go to sleep in a very distracted manner, you'll wake up in a very distracted manner as well. So mornings and evenings are sort of quite useful for setting up the container for your day.
You, or we overall, you often use a language that might not be too understandable for most people. How would you phrase setting up your mindfulness beforehand in a manner that a person who is not necessarily as accustomed to the Pali Canon would understand? Or would one set up their mindfulness?
Like practically, yeah.
Yeah,
So
very practically.
yeah, like for example, if you want to set up the context of impermanence, for example, like obviously it's probably not going to be on like the most deepest supramundane level, but like in the morning, for example, you can literally just actively bring up the thought of the things that you hold dear being subject to impermanence. The main thing there that's really important is that it has to sort of touch you on an emotional level, right? Um, the main thing about having that sort of context is not the like having this specific thoughts about impermanence running around your mind all the time. It's just sort of having um that awareness of being subject to suffering on account of that impermanence, being present in that sort of emotional tenor in the background. So if you sort of bring that up through your thought actively at the beginning, obviously you're thinking about it, and then it sort of emotionally sets in. You can sort of just let go of the thinking and not even like reach after like, okay, what do I do now? What's the practice about? You just literally let that emotional aspect of it just settle into your experience, and you just sort of sit with it without trying to solve it, without trying to get rid of it. You just sort of let it be there. And if you just let it be there, then you realize you can sort of do other things and it will remain there. So, for example, if I set up that morning thing, um, then I go and need to like get dressed for work. Like obviously I'm focusing on putting my trousers on or whatever, and I don't have to really actively think about this impermanence and all the ramifications and everything. But the fact that I've set it up in advance, um, that mindfulness overall, of impermanence, of being subject to all those things will sort of remain there to this sort of 1% background sort of degree. And that's kind of what you want, really. You want something that will endure in the background while you do all those other things. And it's not so much about always bringing it up to the forefront, to the forefront, to the forefront. Um, I mean, hope that made a bit of sense.
Well, for me, it does. I'm just trying to think in terms of the listener who is not as accustomed to this style of teaching. So, in essence, you mainly want to make sure that you never fully forget the instructions that the Buddha gave. I mean, we say that quite often, but mindfulness just means remembering on the most fundamental level. You want to remember the instructions, the teachings of the Buddha. You don't want to lose the emotional connection to the teachings on impermanence, on suffering, and all those things. As long as you manage to color your experience, your emotional experience in some way, or permeate it in some way with this kind of contemplation, it's a success. And it will endure throughout the day. So that's kind of what you try to do. Make sure that you do not really fully forget what you are doing, that you are practicing right now. And this is why morning and evening are so fruitful, or before and after concentrated activity for all that matters, or activity where you cannot give it your 100% or something like that. And in that regard, many of the modern traditions are quite right when they say that morning and evening are good for practice. They are, but it matters a lot what you do during that time. It has to be the right style of practice at that time.
Yeah, and it's also like it's not going to be something where you do it like one time in the morning and then it's going to completely change like the entire way you carry out your day. Like it might be quite like non-palpable. It might fade in and out and that sort of thing, and it might not be even noticeable. But if you do it repeatedly, like every day, and you, like it's not just a mechanical thing, but you're definitely like actually contemplating those things, and you're reading suttas whenever you can, and you're thinking about clearing and developing virtues. Like you're doing the whole practice basically. You'll just sort of start to realize that the amount that you can forget it is just becoming less and less. Like it doesn't matter how much you get distracted. Like the context of impermanence, of craving, being suffering, and so on. It's just gonna start to stick more and more, and that's really like what you want. It's because when you get to that point, um, like you don't have to keep putting it to the forefront, and it doesn't matter even if you try not to think about it, it's going to be there, and it's going to be there because it's actually like it corresponds to the nature of things, whether you like it or not. And realizing it on that level, that's what sort of mindfulness is about.
And it's interesting how slippery the knowledge on Dhamma and all the instructions of the Buddha actually are. If we are not yet established in them, then most people that, or many people that I talk to, report that they always slip out of their mind, that they will not really stick there, that they will not really hold on to the mind. They always go back into the background and are nearly forgotten, simply because that is not the natural way of the mind. And you want to make it natural so that it becomes the default mode of being, so to speak. And this requires a transformation, so to speak, of your entire lifestyle. And even on the level of values that we talk about quite often. You have to value renunciation. You have to value the Dhamma. You have to value the Buddha's teaching, so to speak. Or value letting go, but the right kind.
I mean, when you think about it, like the opposite way of like going with the grain, with sensuality, with craving, with non-mindfulness, that's been something that's been trained and repeated in us for basically our whole lives. And you're like, if you have faith in samsara, like way beyond that as well. So go in the opposite direction. Not only is it going to be difficult, but it's going to take time to sort of undo and untangle those habits. So it's kind of to be expected at the beginning that there's going to be, slipping out of it and so on. But if you stick to it, then it's gonna stick at some point. So, yeah.
At some point, you cannot forget it anymore. Just like if you tried to learn arithmetics on paper in school. It was very hard in the beginning, even though most people will not admit that. But when you were very young, it was very hard. But at some point, it clicked, and then you just understood how it works. And you can tap back into that because now you know how to add numbers on a very deep level. And the understanding of the Dhamma is, well, in that regard, not too different. At some point, it clicks, and then you can tap back into it.
Yeah, that intuitive tapping in, because like when you're in the midst of like tough work, when your attention's been taken as well, it can be like you might want to like, oh, I want to think about impermanence, or like what is really my intention? Like, am I acting on greed, urge, delusion? And it becomes like a really complicated thing. But like going back to the idea of setting up that container of mindfulness, like even if like at the beginning of your day you spend 5 minutes just analyzing your intentions to like the current present feeling of unpleasant, pleasant, or neutral. okay, am I trying to get away from it? Am I trying to go towards pleasant feeling? Am I trying to distract myself from it? And, just don't give in to those unwholesome intentions, even if it's for 5 minutes. Because you've done that at the beginning of the day, you've gained that sort of intuitive sense of how it feels, those intentions of how it feels to give them up, of the actual feeling that's going on in your experience right now. And because you've set up that sort of sense of intuition in regards to it, then later on when you're sort of more, amongst busy work and so on, um, it's not like a long protracted process of what's my intention and so on, because that intuition has been set up in advance and you can sort of feel straight into it. Um, so that's another sort of positive, I guess, of setting up that container at the beginning of the day.
Mm.
And like obviously, like once you become like more advanced in the practice, like for a Sotapanna, for example, these things have become like totally and utterly like intuitive. So for them, it's much easier amongst busy work to just set up that container of mindfulness, of craving, and of the body and so on, because it's just so palpable in the experience. But before that, it can be a bit more difficult. So you kind of focus on what's the most palpable for you, what's the most simple, and then it's quite intuitive, isn't it?
Yeah. But it requires prior training, which is kind of the difficult aspect. People can struggle with it for a very long time. Anyway, I think that was more than enough on that question. Let us
Yeah.
move to the next one. The next one is a bit shorter. It goes as follows. Is being in nature really helpful for Dhamma practice? And if yes, why is that the case? And you can give it your first go.
Um, yeah, I mean, like on the most mundane level, it's just peaceful, isn't it? Like there are no there is no easy access to sensual pleasures
Mm.
in nature. There is no like in the same way like compared to being in a city or a village where or like having a laptop or a phone with you where there's just infinite access to sensual pleasures. Like just being in a forest alone,
Mhm.
there is no easy access there. And that's also felt like on a very immediate level. Um, that sort of distance to sensuality. Like just being in a forest, the mind sort of starts to calm down to some degree. Unless your mind is like really wild, like maybe that it might go wilder there, but in general, like the mind starts to calm down a bit. And
Mhm.
it calms down because that's the natural environment someone who has given up sensual pleasures would be in. The mind just naturally starts to incline that way,
Mhm.
right? So life starts to get more simple. And eventually, yeah, the mind just inclines that way. And it works both ways. Since the mind inclines that way when it abandons sensuality, if you want to abandon sensuality, that's also the best environment to be in. The mind calms down, and then you can start to see a bit more clearly. And
Mhm.
obviously, you can go into like more detailed ways in which nature's been more helpful, but I think that's the most like immediate way. It's peaceful in it.
It's. I would also say that that is the most important aspect. Is a simple distancing yourself from anything that might be craving related. Technically, everything in a city, in a crowded place, is, let's say, a manifestation of other people's greed. We kind of make the environment so that it suits us better. And the more we go into nature, the more untouched that nature is, the more it is apart from craving, the more it is apart from the influence of, well, making the environment more suitable for your taste, so to speak. It does not offer much comfort. It does not offer much anything. But we have to be very careful when we talk about nature. It's more of the withdrawn, untouched kind of nature. If you go into a big city park or something like that, that's not very withdrawn, even though it might have a touch of nature, and it's maybe better than being in the streets or something like that. But overall, you want to be in a place where you are pretty much alone, where it's quiet except for the sound of the wilderness, pretty much, where there is a sufficient amount of distance, even physical distance, between you and sensuality. So in case you bring your phone, better make sure that you do not have internet access or anything like that, or leave it at home, even better. That's a general good idea anyway, to not have mobile internet, maybe if you can, so that you do not have access to that at all times. So that there's just some physical walking distance between sensuality and you, that you cannot just leap out to it and have it at the click of the button. you have to walk for an hour to go back to it, then you will think twice if you re-engage with sensuality. That is even good for a Sotapanna or higher who habitually acts out from time to time. It's not worth it to commit to an hour of work to go back to sensuality to them. They would much rather stay in the forest, as an example. There are multiple positive aspects when it comes to nature. But the distance to anything craving related is very likely the biggest one. And it's inspiring.
100%, yeah. To the point where, like, even the suttas, like, a lot of monks had, like, this almost romantic idea of, like, being in the forest and this, like, calm, serene environment. But it's true, it's conducive. I like the idea you mentioned as well about it being, like, untouched. Because that's also why it's, like, sort of conducive to insight and things like that. Because you realize how much, like, you're completely enclosed within this environment that's not within your control to any degree. And it's something that you depend on rather than being the master of. So, for example, like things in the sutras, like contemplating the elements of earth and wind and so on. Like, yeah, you can get a sort of idea of them abstractly, but when you're living in a household, which has like such degrees of comfort and everything's like so like man-made and square, it doesn't really hit the same compared to being in like proper untouched nature where you can start to see really that this is completely outside of your control. This body has the same nature as these like random growing leaves and trees and river and so on. Or like being in a household, like yeah, the house is made of earth, but it's a symbol of our sense of control, of our sense of sort of domination over nature. The village, the city, just everything is sort of in that sense. So the more you go towards untouched, wild nature, the earth contemplation it's tinged with like danger, like felt existential danger. That's why it's so sort of fruitful. Whereas for us in household, it's just abstract. Even if you try to think of it in this sort of dangerous way, the fact that you're in a household is already sort of that distance to the untouched wilderness. So that's also like the reason why nature is useful.
I mean, nature is, in a sense, an exemplification of dependent origination. It really shows you how dependent on everything you are. It shows you how little control you have. Whereas a household life is exactly the opposite. It shows you how much control you have, how much things actually follow your command if you really try to. And in nature, the entire lifestyle of a monk, essentially, is living as close to dependent origination as you can. You spend much time in environments where you have no control at all or very limited control. You do not even have control over what you get to eat or if you get to eat anything at all. You're completely dependent on things that are completely outside of your control. And choose an environment that makes that more real to you. And that's very helpful. So in essence, nature is quite the optimal environment for practice, I would say. Simply because it's a living example, not just an intellectual thing. It really shows you by example how it feels to be dependent on anything. I mean, step on a way or on a road in a forest, and you have no idea anymore. Step off the road, and you have no idea anymore where you even are, how you get back. It's quite simple, at least where I live, in the forest here.
Yeah, and obviously you can also. It's harder to fake your sense of peace as well because of all those reasons. Like when you're in a nice, like comfy household and you haven't really tested the limits, it's easy to sort of mistake. Like even if I'm sitting and I'm not getting bored and everything. But like when you're like in the middle of the mountains by yourself and like it's torrential rain and your tent's breaking and you're like, oh, I'm actually still completely at peace. That's when you realize like I'm not faking anymore. It's just I'm content with impermanence and obviously not to the degree where you just sit there and just die, but you're content at the most fundamental level.
Yeah. And at some point you might even start preferring that kind of environment. You go there willingly because you notice, oh wow, this really is conducive for my practice. Where I live, for example, in the forest, there are sometimes ancient gravestones that have been put there, just random in the forest. Those are also great places that really have an interesting atmosphere to them where you just can sit down and meditate. No one really goes there, and there's a clear reminder that someone has been killed there or something like that.
Mm.
So it's very helpful in that regard.
Yeah. Obviously, it's like depending on where you live, it's either easier or harder. But the main thing is about sort of inclining that way. Like at the beginning, whatever time and you can get, if you have free time and it's possible, like go and meditate and contemplate nature instead of in your house. So that would be quite conducive to development in general. And then, like over time, you'll just naturally start inclining there more and more.
Yeah, very well. I think we have now about 10 minutes left. So let's try to fit in one more question and we will see if that works. Okay, the next question is, what pushes one, in quotation marks, over the edge towards stream entry? Is there a special training one does right before? Are there catalysts? And how was it for you? You want to start?
What pushes one over the edge towards stream entry? It's quite hard to say because it really depends on the individual. Like there are various different sort of lists in the suttas to what a Sotapanna has sort of acquired. Like they've acquired the five faculties, they've acquired the Noble Eightfold Path, all of these things. They've acquired the seven practices of awakening. So in order to acquire them, you need to develop all of them. So if you take the five faculties, for example, like you might have one person that's like developed in faith and energy and mindfulness and so on, but they don't have concentration, for example. For that person, like the thing they need is not like to contemplate further. They just need to calm the mind further. A different person might be developed in like really calming the mind, but they haven't understood how to consider the experience in a way that allows it to be seen as impermanent, as not mine. So ultimately, like what pushes one over the edge, it depends on what you're missing individually. And the hard thing is that like, when you're not yet a stream mentor, when you're not have acquired those faculties, you don't really know where your blind spots are, except on like a broad level. So obviously, if you're not obtaining tranquility and samadhi in your life, then you can know, yeah, okay, I need to develop that. If I'm not spending time contemplating impermanence and not self, or that sense of self isn't like lessening, you can know, okay, I need to develop that a bit further. But this is why like things like contact with people who are like wiser than you hopefully can sort of edge you towards what you're missing. Like talks about in the sutras, like going towards people who can attain jhana or have attained some level of wisdom and ask them questions about it. Those things are really important. But well, like as the most general level, it's very hard to say. Yeah.
Well, essentially, only you can really know your blind spots, and it's not only that you cannot even really know them, but you can reveal them to you, and that can happen in a conversation with other people. So maybe they recognize something in you that you are also lacking, or that was helpful to them. They can then present that to you, something that was perplexing or hard to understand or hard to grasp. Maybe they can help you understand that. The noble kind of conversation can really help there, as you mentioned before. So if you put forth your understanding of the Dhamma, of the training overall, to other people, and make it open for criticism, that can really help. But in essence, it's a highly individual thing. So whatever is missing is not the same thing for most people. I think in the sutras, Buddha even named 3 very overarching general vehicles that people use for practice, as in faith, samadhi, and wisdom, pretty much. And not even clear to most people what would be their main faculty. What can they use to put into work? That might also be helpful to try and figure out that first, and then seek out people that have similar qualities. At some point, the Buddha even said in one of those suttas, I think it's called According to Their Elements or something like that, that people who incline towards wisdom and use wisdom as a vehicle would radiate towards Sariputta, hear teachings from Sariputta, and then in turn become more like Sariputta. Those people who are inclined towards concentration and use that as a vehicle, they would radiate towards Mahamoggallana. And they started walking back and forth with him. And they became more in line with him. those who were inclined towards ascetic practices were radiating towards Mahakassapa and were walking back and forth with him. And in turn, they became more like him and became more advanced, and he was very helpful to them. So in summary, it's not easy to give advice here because it's always one specific thing that most people are missing, or many specific things. But they are individual, especially in the beginning. People are very heterogeneous and not very much alike, and have very diverse understandings.
Yeah, and there's not really a special training. Like it's the same from Pathogena all the way to Aranchi. Because even that sutta is like, if someone is virtuous, how should they consider their experience to get to stream entry? And it's like, yeah, just develop perception of impermanence and not self and so on. And it's the same from Pathogena, Sotapana, Sakadagami. It's the exact same practice. The only difference really is that like the Sotapana has like intuitively realized it, and so they don't have any doubt about it. It's just about developing it further. Whereas a Pathogena is obviously they don't know exactly what all these terms mean in their experience, and they're still sort of in the experimental stage. They're figuring out what's right and what's wrong. But ultimately, it's the same thing, like just developing virtuous behavior, calming the mind from the hindrances, and analyzing the experience through the lens of dependent origination, seeing uncontrollability, how things are not yours, they arise about themselves, and so on. And if you're just doing all of those things and you're not missing out key elements, like you're not like just calming your mind and not thinking about wisdom, and you're not just like being bookish and thinking about things without calming your mind, you're not missing out the elements of sila and virtuous conduct. You keep developing all of those, then they'll come together at some point.
No.
Yeah.
If you practice sila, your mind will at some point be sufficiently perfected in sila that the mind gathers in samadhi. When the mind is sufficiently gathered in samadhi, seeing reality as it really is the most natural thing in the world. So if you repeatedly practice sila and work towards samadhi, then it becomes natural to abandon the remaining wrong views that you might still hold on to. It's easier to see through them, at least given the instructions of another person who has already walked that way sufficiently. Yeah.
Even if you can't speak for everyone, do you think there's like maybe one thing that you've seen over and over again where there's like a certain blind spot that's preventing development to the next stage?
Actually, quite a good idea. Actually, it's quite the contrary. When I tried to apply those things that have worked for some people, they literally had no effect on others. That was what I found much more intriguing. So when I was sitting in non-activity, as an example, I thought, yeah, that's a way for everyone. It has to work. And then I tried to explain that to other people, and it had no place to land due to the lack of sila most of the time. So it's not so much about the special tips and tricks, I would say. It's much more about the foundation that has to be there. And then you can use such similar vehicles. I would say that most people are least trained in regards to the neutral feeling. So they can very much benefit from non-activity practice, especially towards boredom and things like that. But only if your sila is strong enough. I would say it's much more the patient practice of the Noble Eightfold Path and much less anything specific that pushes you over the edge.
So it's almost like neglecting the right order of practice might be a big thing. Like even at the question, it's almost like trying to skip to the end product. So it's more like you lay the right foundations and then it slowly matures into the next thing naturally. So and that doesn't mean like, never sit down quietly until you're like fully purified in behavior. Like you can sit down and stuff, but like just don't do it to the detriment or without thinking about the fact that you're doing that in order to develop sila as the most sort of foundational aspect of your behavior, like purified bodily conduct, purified speech, and purified even mental conduct, like how it talks about in the sutras, like the covetousness, the anger, and the mundane wrong view as well.
I I think we are very close to the recording limit, so I will make a cut now. Yeah, thank you all very much for listening. I think that was enough on that question anyway. So thank you very much for listening, and see you next time.